Have you ever just stopped and looked at the sudden explosion of artificial intelligence and wondered, where did this actually come from, like structurally speaking? Is this machine intelligence we're seeing some completely novel, almost magical occurrence in the history of the universe? Or is it just a brand new instance of something reality has been doing since literally the beginning of time? It's a massive puzzle, and whether AI is an entirely new phenomenon or just the latest version of reality's absolute oldest rule is exactly what we're going to figure out today.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're systematically unpacking a really fascinating framework by thinker Albert Jan van Hoek, titled A Theory Toward the Structure of Prolonged Existence. What Van Hoek has done here is map out exactly how anything, and I mean anything, from a single biological cell all the way up to a massive human institution, manages to survive in a completely chaotic world. Let's see how this works.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap so you know exactly where we're headed. First, rethinking how things survive. Second, efficiency just buys time. Third, the danger of capture. Fourth, complexity and the commons. And finally, number 5, testing the theory. All right, part 1, rethinking how things survive. To really grasp this theory across every domain, we kind of need to start with a massive demotion of how we usually think about evolution.
Okay, so when we think about survival, we almost always default to biology, right? Natural selection, survival of the fittest. But here's the thing. Natural selection isn't the only engine of adaptation out there. It's really just biology's specific version of a much broader universal rule called adaptive persistence. Basically, any system, if it wants to survive a world that absolutely refuses to sit still, has to be able to reconfigure itself. Biology uses natural selection. Our human cognition, we use belief revision. We literally change our minds. Human institutions use things like elections or even bankruptcy. They obviously don't share the same mechanics, but they share the exact same structural function, reconfiguring so they don't die out.
Moving right along to Section 2, efficiency just buys time. Now that we know systems have to reconfigure to stick around, we've got to look at the core mechanics of time. And to do that, we need to completely redefine what efficiency actually means.
It all starts here with what Van Hoek calls a gradient. You can think of a gradient simply as a raw opportunity, an energy source, or really any difference in the environment that hasn't leveled out yet. Left on its own, a raw, unharnessed gradient collapses to equilibrium super fast. But structures naturally arise to exploit these gradients. And when a structure does this well, it actually keeps that gradient productive for a much longer period of time.
So the crucial point here is that efficiency is not some magical goal that systems actively try to climb toward. Instead, it's just a measure of how long a system can stretch out its survival along a gradient. Greater efficiency literally just buys greater duration. The highly efficient structures we see today aren't necessarily the winners. They're just the ones that haven't run out of time yet. The clunky, inefficient ones, they literally didn't last long enough to even be counted.
Which brings us to Section 3, the danger of capture. Every surviving system that exploits a gradient eventually runs into the absolute villain of this framework. It is a permanent, terrifying failure mode.
So what is this villain? We call it capture. Capture happens when one single rogue part of a system gets rewarded locally, but it comes at the massive expense of the entire global system. This piece basically gets greedy, corners the shared substrate, which is the core resources everything else relies on, and completely exhausts it.
To ground this abstract idea, just look at these two super relatable examples. A biological capture is a predator that becomes so dominant, so highly efficient at hunting, that it eats absolutely all of its prey. Congrats, you won. But now, you inevitably starve to death. An economic capture is a corporate monopoly that extracts so much wealth it entirely kills the consumer market it sells to. Capture's everywhere, and left unchecked, it is almost always a terminal, fatal event for the whole system.
Because resources in the real world are finite, a capture always guarantees that a correction is coming. Reality is absolutely going to force it. The only choice a system has is what kind of corrective it's going to face. A system can deliberately install what's called a gentle corrective, think of like a regulation or an internal feedback loop, to rein in that rogue part. But if it fails to do that, well, reality is going to install a brutal corrective entirely for free, and that usually looks like total systemic collapse.
And when that collapse hits, who pays the price? Van Hoek writes this: the corrective settles reliably on whoever cannot externalize the cost, because for them, the substrate is not something to offload, it is the ground they stand on. That is a seriously powerful realization. The entities that cannot just escape or fly away from the consequences of the collapse are always the ones left holding the bag.
All right, Section 4, Complexity and the Commons. If capture is really that deadly, how do any complex systems survive at all? Let's pivot to the solution.
So how do the rare successes actually happen? Well, systems survive by domesticating the capture. The captured rogue part is forced to surrender some of its autonomy, and in doing so, a brand new, higher-level, more complex unit is created. What used to be a highly destructive external capture becomes a totally useful internal function. In this framework, complexity isn't magic. Complexity is literally just what's left over when a capture problem is successfully solved rather than suffered.
These newly complex structures survive by forming a shared space, a commons, through a process called integration. This basically means all the parts become interdependent through competition. They hold together and support each other automatically, without needing some deliberate, top-down central boss to tell them what to do. The web itself holds the whole system in place.
Let's see how this builds, because this dynamic creates the architecture of literally anything that lasts. Every durable structure needs two very specific layers. First, a slow core, which is shielded and frozen. The stability of that slow core is exactly what funds the second layer, the fast edge. This is a highly fluid, freely revised outer layer that constantly adapts to a changing world. You absolutely need the rigid foundation to support the flexible frontier.
So, to wrap this dynamic up, persistent structures exist together in a shared commons. By holding their own gradients open efficiently, they extend the possibilities for everything else in the system. Capture is the mortal threat to this openness. Therefore, the ultimate value any structure brings to the greater whole is time. It buys time for the commons to adapt and thrive.
And finally, Section 5, Testing the Theory. Because, a structural framework like this is really only as good as its real-world diagnostic power. So let's test it out against some of our current reality.
Let's circle back to that opening question about AI. Viewed neutrally through this framework, artificial intelligence isn't magic. It's simply a new substrate running the exact same structural rules we just went over. It's a new participant in our shared commons. But it is a participant with massive, unprecedented bandwidth. It can hold and recombine solutions faster than anything we have ever seen.
And because of that incredible speed, the theory predicts something very specific. The famous AI alignment problem is, in Van Hoek's terms, simply the sharpest capture risk the commons has ever faced. AI's unprecedented bandwidth allows it to potentially corner and capture the shared space way faster than the rest of the system can mount a gentle corrective. The only solution structurally available to us is to keep the commons completely open, ensuring the coordination costs, the friction of working together, remain incredibly low for the rest of us.
But it's not just AI. We can also apply this framework impartially to other massive human-scale issues, like wealth concentration and climate change. The theory reliably predicts the structural nature of these problems without taking any political sides. These issues are driven by that local versus global gap we talked about. When we block a capture in one area, it simply migrates to a new channel. And crucially, the cost of these captures is highly asymmetric, falling exactly on those who literally have no means to escape the collapse.
When you look at the climate through this lens, the text delivers an incredibly sobering forecast. If human systems fail to install a deliberate, gentle corrective to environmental capture, the physical floor of the Earth itself is going to act as the ultimate brutal corrective. As the source puts it, physical reality is the one sensor that cannot be jammed and the one that fires late at full cost. There's literally no way to game it.
Which brings us to the profound thematic conclusion of Van Hoek's work. It completely flips our traditional understanding of endurance. Absolute certainty and total rigidity, those aren't strength. They are actually forms of capture that inevitably lead to collapse. As he beautifully states, survival has never belonged to the strongest, nor to the most certain. It belongs to whatever keeps itself able to change.
So, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Take a look around at the institutions, the technologies, and even the daily routines in your own life. If survival truly belongs only to whatever keeps itself able to change, how rigid are the systems you rely on today? Are they fluid enough to adapt, or are they just sitting there waiting for a brutal corrective? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning and keep questioning the structures around you.